Hi, I'm Ted Pattison, a Power BI MVP. In this session, I'm going to present developing in Power BI with streaming datasets and real-time dashboards. Before I get started, I want to call out and thank a couple people at Microsoft. Thanks to David Isminger for writing some great articles on real-time streaming and kind of giving me a great head start into preparing for this particular session. Thanks to Adam Saxton for all the work you've done on the Power BI site, giving us so much direction, especially in the more technical areas. And then also thanks to my friend Charles Sterling, who fosters our MVP community. The code and slides for this session are going to be available to everyone in a public repository. So up here at the top, we have this particular URL, github.com, critical path training, real-time dashboards. So the slides for this session are going to be available there. And there are two Visual Studio projects. They're both C# console applications that I'm going to be demoing in this session. And they're both available. And I'd like nothing more than for my demos to be recreated by as many of you as possible. So if you're able to take these slides and these demos and go give the same presentation to one of the Power BI user groups in your area, that would make me very, very happy. And now a quick word from our sponsor. I work for Critical Path Training. We provide in-depth technical Power BI training. We have Power BI Bootcamp for data analysts and database gurus. We also have Power BI Developer Bootcamp for professional developers. So if you like this next hour and you want to have more of the same in a 4-day deep dive, please try out our course. And we'll make sure that you get the shirt that answers the most fundamental question in data science. Who's your data? And now let's move away from the propaganda to sell training classes onto the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to start with a high-level introduction to real-time datasets. So we have to discuss what's the difference between a streaming dataset, a push dataset, and a hybrid dataset. After that, we're going to look at a C# program that creates a streaming set with the Power BI Service API. Next, we're going to look at creating dashboards on top of a streaming dataset using streaming data tiles. After we've done that, and we've looked at creating streaming datasets, we're going to then look and see what the difference is with creating a push dataset. So I'll create a push dataset, and what you're going to see is it has a much richer data model and much more capabilities. But we're also needing to understand what are the trade-offs between the streaming dataset and the push dataset. At the very end, because everyone's listened so intently, I'm going to reward you by showing you how to integrate some things in Azure, in particular creating an Azure Event Hub, and then using an Azure Streaming Analytics job to basically integrate with Power BI to create a hybrid data set and to basically push in data so we can create a Power BI real-time dashboard on top of incoming data streams that are basically being filtered through Azure in a highly scalable way. Sounds interesting? Let's go ahead and move on. The first thing we have to come to terms with is the difference between a pulled dataset and a real-time dataset, or at least a dataset that supports a real-time dashboard. So the idea with pulled datasets is that the Power BI service will be pulling the data from the data source. Now, there are several different types of pull datasets, and you're probably familiar with most of them. The most popular is the imported dataset that you've basically created with Power BI Desktop. You've created queries, and the idea is running a query is going to pull the data in. And once you publish your project to the Power BI service and you refresh your data, your queries run, once again, pulling the data into Power BI. Now, you might have also worked with direct query datasets. The idea of a direct query dataset is that we don't import any data, but when someone opens a report or someone clicks on a filter, such as a slicer, Power BI reaches out, runs a query against the database, but once again, direct query is a pull method. Now, the last of the pull datasets is when we have a SQL Server Analysis Services database, could be multidimensional, could be tabular, and when we create a Power BI report on top of that, what happens is that every time someone opens the report, it's going to make either an MDX or a DAX query against the dataset. But once again, it's a pull dataset. So now we're going to introduce a whole new set of dataset types, and that's real-time datasets. And the big thing that distinguishes the real-time datasets from the pull datasets is that now we need some entity, probably a custom application, that's going to be pushing the rows into the Power BI service, which is inherently different than all the pull models. So the idea of a real-time dashboard is that it's looking at data, and then as we push more data in from our custom application, Power BI reacts by updating tiles inside of our dashboard. Now, what we're going to see over the next couple slides is that there are three fundamental types of real-time datasets. First of all, there are streaming datasets. Secondly, there are push datasets, and these two are quite different. There's the hybrid dataset that has characteristics of both. So now let's go through and talk about the differences between each one. We'll begin with the streaming dataset. With the streaming dataset, the most important characteristic is that when an application pushes data in, it's not stored in any backing database. Instead, it's just stored in a cache inside the cloud. And you can't expect the data to be in the cache for more than about an hour once you put it inside. Now, also the streaming dataset is fairly constrained from a data modeling perspective. You can only create a single table in a streaming dataset, and there's no rich data modeling. For instance, you can't put a formatting string on a particular column. Think of it as a painter that's just taking paint on the brush and flinging it right on the canvas. Now, what you're going to see is that when you have a streaming data set, it's not supported by the standard Power BI reports designer that you're used to. And therefore, the standard set of visualizations that you're used to putting on reports and then being able to pin them to a dashboard, you can't use those. Instead, there is a set of streaming data tiles that we're going to be looking at, and you have to use those. And what you're going to find is when you work with a streaming data set, currently you have rows of data that you're looking at, and they're replaced by other rows of data. So you're not going to have any support for writing any type of DAX evaluation. There's no real aggregation of values. The next value that comes in simply replaces the value that was there before, and there's nothing like filtering that you're used to in Power BI visuals. Next, we have the push data set. Now, with the push data set, as data is pushed into Power BI has figured out a way to create an Azure SQL database behind the push data set, so the data is not stored in cache. Now, we'll see that the push data set also is much better from a data modeling perspective. So you can add multiple tables and you can create relationships between your tables. Also, there's good news in the fact that once you have data in the Azure SQL database, you can use the familiar reports designer and you can use all the visualizations that you're familiar with. You can put them on a report and then you could pin them to a dashboard. Okay, remember with all real-time data sets, the end goal is to put them in a dashboard, not a report, because dashboards have the automatic updating as new rows are pushed in and reports do not. But the report will be the intermediary at which I design my visuals before I pin them to the dashboard that will then kind of show the data as it's updated in real time. Now, what's nice about the push data set is that we support writing DAX because you can write measures to complement the columns in your tables. And then also because of the visuals that we have, we support aggregation. We support different types of filtering. So you have a much richer data modeling experience when you're working with a push data set compared to a streaming data set. And finally, we have the hybrid data set. So the hybrid data set is distinguished because it has its rows tracked in both the cloud-based cache like the streaming data set and also in an Azure SQL database like the push data set. So the hybrid data set is really the hermaphrodite of the real-time data set world. Now, because it has to be a streaming data set, it has the same constraints. So hybrid data sets are restricted to a single table and no rich data modeling. Now, because they are a streaming data set, they're supported by these streaming data tiles. But because they have a SQL database, they're also supported by the Power BI report designer and the visuals that you're used to. Now, while streaming data sets don't really have any aggregate capabilities because all they get to use is real-time tiles, because the hybrid data set can use the visualizations you're used to from the report designer, those visuals have aggregation built in, so they can do sums and averages and counts. So actually the hybrid data set has a portion where you can use different aggregations because of the visuals that you really can't get to in a streaming data set alone when you're only restricted to the real-time tiles. Okay, so now that we've looked at the three different types of data sets, what I'd like to do is start with a quick no-code demo and basically show how we can create a hybrid data set In my first demo, I'm just going to work within my own personal workspace. I have a Power BI Pro license. And so inside of my personal workspace, I'm going to pull down the Create menu and choose Create Streaming Dataset. Now, given the choice of what source, I'm going to create it with the API. And then I get to name the dataset inside there. And I'll just call this my hybrid dataset. And now we're going to have a couple columns that we're going to add. Now, remember that there's only going to be one table if you create a streaming or a hybrid dataset, which is what we're creating. They automatically name the table real-time data. You get to name the dataset, and then you get to name the different columns inside. So we'll go ahead and we'll have two different columns. The value column will have a number. The category will have a text type. Now, this is important down below. So what we see right here is something that allows me to switch between the streaming dataset. If historical data analysis is off, it basically says no Azure SQL database. If I turn this on, it simply converts it from a streaming dataset to a hybrid dataset that in addition to the cache-based data, there's also going to be a SQL database behind this. Okay, let's go ahead and choose Create. Now, once I choose Create, it gives me this little screen that has the dataset info. Now, I go ahead and I choose Done. And so once I've done that, and I've created this new dataset inside there, let's go ahead and refresh. Note that because it's hybrid, not streaming, I'm going to have the button to create a new report using the Power BI Reports Designer. Also note that I can get back to that previous screen API info with this little icon with the information sign inside. Now, the idea is that we have a URL, and the idea is if you take this URL and you create an HTTP post, you'll be able to add data inside there. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, let's look at an example. So let's say that instead of using raw or curl, we go over to PowerShell. And so let's say that I take this PowerShell code inside here. And so with this PowerShell code, let's go ahead and create a text file. I'm just going to go right down to my machine, and inside of my demos folder, I'm going to go ahead and right click and choose new text file. Let's go ahead and put that code that they've given me inside there. Okay, I'll go ahead and choose save. And now what we'll do is we'll go back and we'll take this script, and I've already got a script, so I'll call this one my other script. Remember, with PowerShell, the extension is PS1. So now that I've created this script in here, I'm going to go ahead and right-click and choose Edit to open it up with the PowerShell ISE. Now, notice that they have the URL here as one big thing that goes into it basically has the GUID for my workspace. Into Datasets, it has the dataset. It also has a key here at the end, which basically gives the security information. And the idea is that if you have that particular key, you're going to be able to add rows inside. Well, now there is some PowerShell code to create a payload inside here, and then a third PowerShell line of code, which invokes a commandlet, which issues an HTTP post request. So let me go ahead and we'll change this value to 10, and we'll go ahead and change this to category A inside here. And let's go ahead and save. And then I'm just going to go ahead and run this once. Okay, let's go ahead and switch it to 15. And then this time it will be category B inside. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go back and let's create a quick dashboard. Now, because it's a hybrid, notice that I have the Create Report button. So I can go into the regular Report Designer. Let's go ahead, click into the new Report Designer inside here. And so note, if I just create something like a table, and we have the category and the value inside there, let's go back here and do a actual with. And now you can see that we're adding these values. Now, let's go ahead and save what we've done. And so this is going to be the hybrid, but this is the report. So I'll just call this one the hybrid report. And so what's going to be important is that we take this and we go ahead and we put it inside of a dashboard. So this is going to be my hybrid inside here. And once we've created this dashboard, let's go ahead and move over to the dashboard. Let's go back here, and now let's put in another value, and let's say this one is going to be category C inside, and we'll go ahead and execute that inside there. And you can see behind me, my dashboard is updating in real time. Okay, now let's put another value inside there. This time we'll put 20, except we'll update a category that's already been updated. Category A, let's go ahead and run that inside there. And what you're going to see here is that category A is showing the aggregate values because I've added 2 rows inside there. Okay, now that we've done that, and we've got this first tile, and this tile is just from the regular old report designer, you're kind of used to it. Let's add another tile, but this time a streaming data tile. So I'm going to go to the Add Tile, and once I click on Add Tile, the Add Tile dialog comes up, and I'm going to pick Real-Time Data. I'm going to click on Next, and it's going to show me all the different streaming datasets and hybrid datasets that I have in this workspace as options for me to create the streaming data tile on top of. I only have one hybrid dataset right now, so I'll go ahead and choose that. And now that I've done that, you can see that here is the set of streaming data tile types. So let's say that I just pick card for now. Now I pick card, and I'm able to add a value inside there, and that value is 20. And let's go ahead and choose Next. And now what I can do is I can show you one of the big differences between the streaming data tiles and the regular visuals that you create in a report and then pin. So let's now go back, and let's go ahead and put one more value inside there. And so I'll go ahead and click OK and push this new row in. And what you see about the streaming tile is it doesn't really care about the history of data. The latest value replaces the value before it. However, if you're able to use the non-streaming tiles, the ones that were used from report view, you get that concept of aggregation, which is built in. This demo was billed as party tricks for real-time datasets. So let's go ahead and move back and go ahead back here in the dataset, and let's go back to the API info, and note that you have a push URL here. Okay, I just showed you how to add rows inside there with PowerShell. Can you do it with Fiddler? Let's go ahead and bring up Fiddler inside there. And as Fiddler is up inside, we're going to use something in Fiddler which is called Composer. So when we use Composer in here, the idea with Composer is that you can decide what is your operation that you like to send. We'd like to send a post request, and what is the URL. Let's go back here, and if I go back to the browser and I take this URL inside here, and now we go back here into Fiddler and we paste that in. Okay, well, first of all, I've got the URL. Second, what is the request body? Well, how nice of them to give me the request body inside here. So let's go ahead and grab that particular value and put that back inside. Okay, now let's say that our value this time is going to be 150. Okay, and we will basically go into, once again, category A inside there. And now that we have done that, let's go ahead, move back to our dashboard inside here. And sometimes the dashboard gives you a hard time while you're testing. If I go ahead and do a hard refresh on the browser, quite often that kind of fixes things inside. Okay, but now let's go ahead and execute this inside. And if we've done everything correctly, not only do we know how to, use the party trick with PowerShell, but we could basically use Fiddler now to kind of push in and push our values inside there. Great stuff. Okay, onward and upward. Now that we've talked about the basics of real-time datasets, let's move ahead and talk about creating a streaming dataset with a custom application using the Power BI Service API. Okay, first, let's ground ourselves in a real-world, real-time scenario. So let's imagine that we're working at some type of chemical processing plant. Let's just kind of call it the Heisenberg Labs. And we have various chemical processes that we have to run. And so what's very important is that we monitor temperatures during these various processes. And so we want to make sure temperatures don't get too high. We want to make sure that they don't raise in an accelerated fashion. And we want to monitor them on a per second basis. And that gives us a need for a real-time dashboard. Now, let's say that when we have temperatures that run out of whack, we need to have alerts sent to our top crack engineers that are basically working to make sure that everything stays safe. Okay, so now that we have a real-time scenario, let's go ahead and look at the project we're going to be working with. It is a Visual Studio 2017 console application, and it's basically just a very simple custom application which is going to create a few different types of data sets, streaming, hybrid, and push data sets, and then it's going to push rows in. And I've really created this as demoware. Once again, I'm hoping that I've kept the applications as simple as possible to make it easy for other people to do the same demos that I'm going to be doing here. Now, there's only 2 NuGet packages that I had to install. There is a .NET DLL for version 2 of the Power BI Service API. I did not use that. Here, I'm just basically using the Microsoft Identity Model Clients.Active Directory. So that is what we call the Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADL for .NET. And I'm using Newtonsoft JSON package to be able to basically convert my C# objects into JSON, and then also to convert JSON result sets back into C# strongly typed objects. Okay, before I jump into the sample code, let me walk through a couple of the pieces of code that you're going to see inside there. Now, in order to create a data set or to be able to add rows to a data set, you need to be able to make a post request. So I have an execute post request helper method that takes the URI of the target and also another string parameter, which is the post body that we want to send in. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create an HTTP content object, which will serve as the body of the post request. We'll set the content type to application/JSON. Then we'll create the HTTP client object to be able to transmit the post request. Now, inside my application, I have some very minimal code that obtains an access token, and we're going to basically need that, and we're going to have to add that to the authorization header. But the idea is that once you've got the access token and you know the endpoint, the URI that you want to post to, and you have the body, you're going to be able to basically make a post request right to the Power BI service with the JSON body, which is either going to create a data set or it's going to add rows. Now, when it's time to add a new data set, first one we're going to add is a streaming data set. So note that there is a default mode. And the idea of the default mode is we either set it to streaming, to push, or push streaming. So here we're basically saying I want to create a streaming data set. Now, you have tables, and remember with a streaming data set you can only add one table, and it's named temperature readings. And so also note that we have individual columns and we have individual data types. And when you have a streaming data set, or a hybrid data set for that matter, the only thing you can add for columns is their name and their data type. You can't add anything like a format string inside there. Now, once we've got our data row modeled, we have to be able to make requests. So in this first request right here, what we're going to do is we're going to get that string, which is the JSON that defines the streaming data set and the single table inside. Now, we're going to go ahead and execute a post request. And the idea is we post over to the Power BI service, and in the request body, we basically add a JSON to create the streaming data set. Yet when it returns the result back to me, they also give me a JSON result from which I can track the dataset ID of the dataset that I have just created. And GUIDs are going to be important as you work with code, because as you create your URIs, you're going to have to add the GUID to the URL to basically do something such as add rows into that dataset. Now, this application also gives you an approach for adding rows as strongly typed C# objects. So note that we have this class, temperature reading row. Now also, when you add rows, even if you're adding one, you have to add them as a collection. So we have a temperature reading rows class as well that has nothing more than an array of the temperature reading row and its name rows. And the name of that rows is important because that's the schema of the JSON that the service expects. Now, if we look at this code here, it creates a new instance of the temperature reading row. It then creates an instance of the temperature reading rows and puts our one row inside there. And then we're going to serialize that object. And the idea is we want to serialize it as JSON. And once we serialize this as JSON, we can then target our data set. And so note, when you look at this URL down inside there, and so what I'm talking about is this right inside here. Sorry about the line inside there, but what you can see is we need to have the base URL to datasets, then the GUID of our dataset, /tables, then whatever your table name is, /rows. And by basically making that post request is how we're going to start adding rows into our dataset. Okay, sounds great. Time for another demo. So in the first demo, we're going to start working with a C# console application, which is called Streaming DatasetsDemo. Remember that this is up in the GitHub repository. You can download, you can do the exact demo I'm about to do. Now, note that inside the JSON folder that we have the JSON definitions for things like our streaming dataset inside here. Now, before we can run this, we have to do something with respect to security. So I'm going to go into models and I'm going to open up the Power BI service.cs file. And so note down here that our application, in order to connect to the Power BI service and be authenticated as a user, needs to have a client ID. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move back to the browser. Let's go ahead and duplicate this tile so I'm still authenticated here. And I'm going to go to portal.azure. So if I can type in portal.azure.com. And now I move over to the Azure portal. Now, I have to be running as an account that has enough permissions to register an application within my current tenant. Note that you do not need an Azure subscription to do what I'm about to do. You just basically need permissions to get to the Active Directory section. And once we get to Active Directory, notice that there's going to be app registrations. So here's an application I've already registered to make this demo work, but let me go ahead and just do it a second time. So we'll go ahead and click on New Application Registration. So this is going to be my Streaming Dataset Demo number 2. And when I do that, this is not going to be a web API, it's going to be a native application. Now you have to put in a redirect URI. With a native application, doesn't really matter what that is. So I typically use something such as HTTPS localhost app 1234. Okay, but that's going to have to be added inside there. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and create our new application. Once we've created this application, let's go ahead and open it up. And it's got a client ID, also known as the application ID. So let's go ahead and grab that value. Let's go back to our application. And so now it has the correct GUID. Now, if I run this right now, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because my application requires permissions with the Power BI Service API. So finally, let's go back here. And under required permissions, we're going to go ahead and choose Add. We're going to say Select API. And we're going to go to the Power BI Service API, choose Select. And what are the things? We need to read and write all dashboards, not really. Add views, read and write all data sets. That is the one permission that we really need. However, I'll just go ahead and take all of them. Let's go ahead and choose Select and then Done. And now we've added permissions. Now, one little tidbit of information. If I click Grant Permissions, it will basically provide the interactive consent. If I don't grant permissions here, what's going to happen when I run this? Let's go back here. So what we want to be able to do is run this application, which is going to create a streaming data set. However, the first time it runs, here's how we're going to get an access token. The Active Directory Authentication Library has an authentication context. So we're going to create a new one of those. We're basically going to point to the authorization login point for Azure Active Directory, login.microsoftonline.com/common. And once we create the authentication context, we're going to grab an access token And note that for console or desktop style applications, I can parameterize this such that it will just bring up a dialog. So let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this right here. And when I run it, note that it prompts me to log in. So I'll go ahead and I'll log in. And as I log in, for the very first time, it's going to make me consent. And the idea is that anytime a user has permissions that they're delegating to the application, such as this case right here, either the user has to click consent right here on the first time, or the other option would have been for you to grant permissions up here. And the idea is if you click grant permissions, you don't have to go through the interaction and accept that inside there. Now, every other time I run this, it's going to be fine. I don't have to do that inside there. Now, back inside of our application, the way things work, let's go back here and look at the program, is that in this case, I'm not really doing anything yet. So let's go ahead and stop. And let's go ahead and uncomment this first choice right here. So here, we're going to create a streaming data set. So I'm going to go ahead and run this right here. And once again, it's going to ask me to log in each time. A nice little trick is once and it just kind of failed inside there, I'm now going to go back to the Power BI service inside here. And one thing to note right here is that once I've gotten past that first time when you have to provide an interactive login, what you can then do after that point, let's come back here, uncomment this code. I can now create a user password credential. And so now every time I run it, it's not going to ask me to log in. I can just basically pass my username and password, and it's going to make it a lot easier, as I'm writing my code inside there. Okay. Now, what's going to happen now is I'm going to run some code that's going to create a streaming data set and start adding rows inside. So let's go ahead and run this right here. And as I run this, it's creating the new streaming data set. Let's go ahead and now move back into Power BI. And here's the streaming data set that's been created. Now first, let me point out that there is no button to create reports. Because it is a streaming data set, the only way that I could visualize what's inside there is to create a dashboard and add the streaming data tiles. So let's go ahead and create a new dashboard. We'll create a dashboard, demo 1, and this is going to be our streaming data set. And so once we create this, now we're going to say add tile. And I'm going to go ahead and add a tile. And note that when I add a streaming data tile, I have to select from one of the existing hybrid streaming data sets. So there's the streaming data set. We'll go ahead and choose next. And so now I'm going to pick from one of these types inside here. Now, in our case right here, let's say I pick a card at first, and I go and I look at a particular value inside. Now, my code's running, so my code continually is adding in new rows. And you can see if you have a card, it just basically takes the previous value and replaces it with the new value inside. Okay, well, let's say I don't use a card, but let's use a gauge. Now, in our sample data set, not only am I passing the temperature, of 3 different batches that we're running, but I'm also passing values for the minimum value and the maximum value and the target value inside there. And so you can see that quite often when you're creating one of these particular data sets inside, let's go ahead and choose next. And now we'll go ahead and add a title inside here. Let's go ahead and choose OK. So I basically had to pass extra values, just to get the gauge to start at 100, end at 250, and show me a target value of 2012. Now, if this were a push data set instead of a streaming data set, I could add extra tables to have lookup values. But because you're limited to a single table, you really can't do that with a streaming data set. Now, I'm going to quickly throw a couple more gauges up there. So we have 3 different boilers, and we have batch A, batch B, and batch C. So let's go ahead and we'll add in some tiles for that. And then also, as I mentioned, you really can't get aggregations in the streaming data tiles but you can start looking at the history of temperature readings over time. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a line chart. And as we add in this particular line chart, we'll show the three values of temperature A, B, and C inside there. Now, as we start looking at these values over time, you're going to see that they're for small windows. You really can't keep data in memory for more than an hour. For instance, if I go and look at the properties of this tile, I only get to choose a time window between 1 minute and 1 hour. Now, I'm going to go ahead and speed things up here. So we're looking at 5 minutes worth of data, so I'll speed it up a couple, 10 or 15 times just to not take so much time here. But the whole idea of the streaming data set is you're examining things that are all occurring in a very small time window. Okay, now let's move back to Visual Studio. So now that we have seen the streaming data set, let's go ahead and close down, and I'm going to go ahead and comment out the call that creates the streaming data set and uncomment the call that's going to create the hybrid data set. Now let's go ahead and start running this right here. And so now this begins to run. And so if we go back and we take a look at our data sets, now we've created data set 2. So one big difference between the streaming data set and the hybrid is right here. You see that I can simply click on the Create Report button to create something inside the hybrid. Now the hybrid is just like the streaming data set in the sense that I can use the streaming data tiles. So let's create another dashboard. Just we'll call new, and we'll create, this one will be Demo 2. And we'll create a hybrid dataset dashboard. So let's go ahead and add a tile. So we'll go ahead and we will add a tile. And just like before, let's go ahead and add a gauge inside here. So this time we'll pick hybrid. We'll click next. We'll go ahead and we'll add a gauge just like we did in the streaming datasets dashboard. So temperature A, that's great. What is the minimum value? What is going to be the maximum value inside here? And then what is going to be the target value? Okay, so there's really no difference between what I just did and what I did before in the earlier demo with the streaming data set. Let's go ahead and choose OK. Now, let's go ahead and compare this now to what we can do by using a report first. So going back here, we'll go to Datasets, we'll go to our hybrid data set, and we'll click on New Report. So here I am in the familiar report designer with my real-time data set inside here. So let's go ahead and create a gauge, and let's go ahead and put a temperature inside there. And the first thing I see is this really large value. What's going on here? Well, I go back over here and note that in our case right here, we only have the ability to look at aggregate roll-ups inside there. So what you're going to find is that sometimes you want an aggregate roll-up, but when you just want to see the last value, that's not really going to give you something. I could average things inside here, but once again, you might find that things like the gauge and card aren't very useful unless you want to aggregate values. So let's take something different. Let's go ahead and take a line chart. I'm going to go ahead and take a line chart. And with my line chart, let's go ahead and for the axis, we'll go ahead and take the time dimension inside there. And then for the temperature, we'll take temperature of batch A inside. And so what you can see here is we start getting some type of a sense of things that are inside. Now also, each time we have the temperature run up and down, we have a different batch inside there. Okay, so now that I've done that, let's go ahead and save my report. And so we'll go ahead and save this as Demo 2. And so now that I've saved the report, I have the potential to take my report and basically pin it to an existing dashboard. And we'll use Dataset 2. We'll go ahead, choose OK. And so now what we have on our dashboard is we have a real-time streaming data tile on the left and a typical visual on the right. So depending on whether you want aggregations or not, generally tells you whether you want to use the streaming data tiles that do not support aggregation and the standard set of visuals that we have in report design that do support aggregation. Now if we skip ahead a little bit in time, we can see another advantage of the hybrid over the streaming data set. And that is the streaming data set will never have data that's older than an hour old. So with the hybrid data set, you're storing data in a database. And so if you want to look at things that are historic, meaning 90 minutes or older, well, we need a hybrid, not a streaming data set. So the hybrid data set gives you the ability to, basically capture real-time data, but then to be able to play it back or at least go back and look at larger time windows, maybe an hour, a day, longer than a day inside there. And now it's time for us to move ahead and talk about push data sets. Well, we've seen what the streaming data set is, a set of rows in memory where we can basically project its values up into streaming data tiles. And then we saw the hybrid data set, a streaming data set with a longer memory and the ability to use both type of visuals. So now with the push data set, what is the scenario that we're simulating here? So imagine we have a website and we're trying to raise campaign contributions in very short order. Maybe we have a 12-hour period or something like that. So the idea is we have developers who have written code in the contributions website, and as someone makes a contribution, they take their credit card, they call into a web service for the credit card authority to charge their credit card, and then they call into the Power BI service to basically push rows to update a real-time dashboard. Now, when we start working with a push data set, what we're going to see is that we have a lot more flexibility when it comes to data modeling. So first of all, we can have multiple tables. So we have a table which is named contributions. We're also going to have tables for lookup values inside there. Now, when we look at our columns, notice that you can have a data category. So we have state or province for the state column. We have a data category of place for the city column and postal code for the zip code column. Also note that we have things like the time column, which is date time, which basically has a specific format string, as does the amount window of the contribution amount. Okay, finally, notice that there's also a section for measures. So this makes it infinitely more powerful than working with streaming data sets and hybrid data sets in the fact that you could write DAX, which will be evaluated, and your DAX evaluations can have formatting on the end of it. Now, another thing that we've designed into this sample is this idea of a tumbling time window. So when we look at the different columns, well, basically we're pushing in the different rows that represent contributions, the name of the contributor. We also have information about the amount, how much is each contribution. We have geographic information, what is the city, and note that we have a data categorization for a city, marked it to place. So when we have things like the city, state, it's going to be able to locate it in one of the Power BI visuals inside there. Now, we also have gender, but when it gets to time, instead of returning back a timestamp on each row, we're going to take every single value and we're going to start creating these time windows. For instance, you could create a time window every 30 seconds. And so things will either have a 00 or they will have a 30 at the end of it. So let's go ahead and jump into our code sample for creating a push data set. Okay, so here we are back in Visual Studio, returning to the scene of the crime. Let's go ahead and I'm going to comment out the line that creates the hybrid data set, and I'll uncomment the line that is going to create the push data set. Now, there's one source file, Power BI service.cs, where I've written my little wrapper code inside here. And so one of the things that you'll see is it uses code inside of the campaign contributions source file to create these particular C# objects that we convert into rows in JSON. But here we have a time value that we're creating. So note that we take the time down to the minute, and then we take the seconds and we do some type of a math operation so that the number comes out either 0, 15, 30, or 45. So basically everything in a 15-second window is being rolled up into a single value. And what you're going to see is we can start using that for things like the axis for a bar chart and so on. Okay, now let's go ahead and run this particular piece of code right here. And the idea is that once we run this, it's created the new push data set and it's beginning to add rows inside there. So let's go back, and now we see that we have our push data set. Now here we have no choice other than to use the standard reports designer. So remember, since it's a push data set, you cannot use the streaming data tiles. So we'll go ahead and we'll open this up. And so now we have a contributor, and what we can do is we can add for the city. We can go ahead and also, now that we have measures inside there, the first thing we'll create is a table. And as we create this particular table inside here, what we're going to do is to add in the total contributions. I know you can't see that right now. Let me go ahead and switch it to actual size. And then we'll basically make it so the city with the greatest number of contributions is up toward the top. Now let's go ahead and save what I've done. So we'll go ahead and save this report as demo 3. And then let's go ahead and create a new dashboard to pin this to. So this will be demo 3. And now we have our push data set inside here. And so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and see what our dashboard looks like. And now what you're going to see is that things are going to be moving around inside there. Now, what's nice about this demo application, let's go ahead and take it and stop it. Let's go back and start it up one more time. So what's kind of nice about this demoware is each time you do that, it's basically going to see that the data set's already created. It's going to empty all the rows from the contributions table and start things again inside here. So now what you can see is kind of in real time, things are coming through there. Okay, so we've got the contributions inside. What else might we want, on our dashboard? Now, I've created a second dashboard already using a different name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stop this right here. And I'm going to go ahead and start up one more time, but using the name of a data set that I created ahead of time. Let's go ahead and start that up inside there. And so now that this has started, let me go back here and notice that there is this report that we have, which is political campaign contributions. And if we look at this inside here, I started putting together a particular dashboard. Okay, and then also I took the tiles from there and I created this dashboard inside here. Now, let me make the dashboard a little bit smaller so you can see it all in all. But what we have here is kind of the makings of a real-time dashboard, and we basically have a push data set behind. So some of the nice things that we get here is the ability to have rich data modeling. Without that, I wouldn't be able to go to the city column and be able to basically configure it with a data categorization of place, which is required for us to be able to see on the map, reach down here, and be able to kind of see how things are growing out. We can also do things, such as use area charts and line charts to basically see, how data is growing over time. Now here, I'm using a gauge. You saw me use a gauge earlier, but that was very different because that gauge was being used to show individual temperature values. So remember, no aggregation. Every time you pushed in a new temperature, it replaced the earlier one. But now, since this gauge is not a streaming data tile, it's from the standard report visual set, it's aggregating the values. And that's what we want here. We want all the different contribution values aggregated together to show us a particular total. Now I'm going to shut down the application, return to Visual Studio and restart it. So we basically start with a fresh set of data. I'm also going to speed up the video about 5 times just to kind of see how the dashboard plays out over time. So we basically have a dashboard that's showing us the total number of contributions, the contribution amount, the average contribution. I have a gauge that's showing me where I am against the goal that we're going after. If you look at the area chart, it's showing us these time windows of 15 seconds. So we're able to see when revenue's on the increase, and we're able to see when things flatten out like they did in the middle. And then also we have a map down below, which allows us to effectively see geographic areas. So now you've seen a demo of all 3 types of real-time data sets: streaming, push, and hybrid. So now that you've done that, it's going to be a lot easier for you to understand the real-time dataset matrix. So on the first row, which ones update in real time? And the answer is all of them. Streaming, hybrid, and push datasets are all meant to automatically update all the dashboards that are built on top of them. Now, which ones have the smooth animations? Basically, that means which ones use the streaming data tiles. The streaming and hybrid datasets can use the streaming data tiles, but the push datasets cannot. Which ones are backed by the Azure SQL database? Well, the hybrid and the push. Streaming is not. Which ones can you build reports with the standard Power BI Reports Designer? Same answer as the last question. Each that has the SQL database behind it, which is hybrid and push, can be used to design reports. Which ones allow rich data modeling? That's not supported for streaming or hybrid. It's only supported by push. And remember, the rich data modeling is that you can define your columns with things like data categories and format strings, and you can add measures, and you can have multiple tables, and you can have table relationships. And then finally, you see there's a difference between the ingestion rate. So what Microsoft states as the number of rows and the amount of data you can push in, well, with streaming and hybrid, it's 5 requests per second. And you see there's a 15 KB request size limitation. So with push, there's not as many per second, 1 instead of 5 per second, but you can put lots of rows in, up to 16 megabytes worth of data per request. Okay. Well, now that you've bared with me and you've listened to me as I talked about how to create real-time datasets in Power BI directly with the API, now what we're going to do is take a venture into seeing how we can integrate things in Azure, Event Hubs, and Azure Streaming Analytics jobs together with Power BI to create a hybrid dataset and a real-time dashboard. Now, what we've looked at so far is a fairly low-velocity data scenario. And we have a console application that was using HTTP, or HTTPS really, to basically push new rows across the network. Now, if you can only make 1 request per second, well, how does that bode when you have scenarios where you have lots of different senders? So we need to deal with high velocity data scenarios. So imagine the case where you have lots of different data senders. Maybe they're cars that have geographic location devices inside of them. Maybe they're freezers that have temperature thermometer devices inside there. But the idea is that we need to send lots of requests and we need some type of scalable listener. Now, we're going to be using an Azure Event Hub. Now, when you create a client application to push rows, or we're basically going to call them events, that we send to the Event Hub, we can use a special client library that allows us to easily send those with the Azure Service Bus. So we're not even going to be using HTTP. The big difference there is the Azure Service Bus is kind of like Uber, where the HTTP is public transportation. It's just going to give us a far more performant, far more reliable way to send a large number of requests with rows to the listener. Now, once we've created the Event Hub, the second thing we're going to have to do is to create an Azure Streaming Analytics job. And what that does is it gives us a way to kind of tap in with the input of the job to the stream that's being sent to the Event Hub. And then we're going to create a output, which is basically going to have the Azure Streaming Analytics service create a hybrid data set inside of Power BI for me. So once we get that whole picture right there, you're going to see that the client application will send events, which basically represent rows, into the Event Hub in a highly scalable way. The Azure Streaming Analytics job will basically take that data and basically allow us to refine it and then to basically pass it into Power BI as rows into a hybrid data set. So far, we've created 3 different data sets: the demo 1 streaming data set, the hybrid data set, the push data set, but we've created all of them by making calls directly into the Power BI Service API. So in this last demo, we're going to go to the Azure portal and we're going to create things that will then create a hybrid data set on our behalf. So I go to the Azure portal at portal.azure.com. I'm going to switch over to the Azure Active Directory tenant that holds my subscription. So I'm going to look at resource groups, and there's one resource group called real-time dashboards, and I haven't added anything in. So I need to create two on-demand Azure services, an Event Hub and then an Azure Streaming Service job. So I'm going to click on the New button up on the top left, and then when I have this menu of options, I'm going to click on Internet of Things. So when you click on Internet of Things, we see the Event Hub first, and then secondly, I'm going to create a Streaming Analytics job. So first of all, let's click on the Event Hub. Now, to create a new Event Hub, you have to create a new domain. And really, you're not creating an Event Hub at first, you're creating a container, which is called a Event Hub namespace. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use Heisenberg Lab as the name of our domain. So heisenberglab.servicebus.windows.net becomes the important namespace that our event hubs will live inside when we create them inside of this namespace. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. And now it's creating the container. And so if I drop this down, we basically look at the progress of creation of the Event Hub namespace. And once this is done, we're going to go into that Event Hub namespace and create a Event Hub inside there. Okay, now we see it's been created. Let's go ahead and move over to that new resource. And what we see here is when we have a namespace for event hubs, I can create an event hub. I'm going to do that in just a second. But also there is a shared access policy settings pane. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the existing shared access policy that's already created called root manager shared access key, and I'm going to take the connection string out of that. In practice, generally you should create a new shared access policy that has just the right level of permissions for what you need. So in our case right here, I'm going to open up this one shared access policy that was already created, and I'm going to grab the connection string off that because I'm going to need that in just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that to the clipboard. Now, in addition to having the connection string for the namespace, we're also going to create a new particular hub inside here. So I move back here and I click on the new event hub. Now, what are we going to call the hub? And I'm just going to call this one Lab A. Now, once we've created this, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. And so now we have two different things. We have a connection string and the name of our particular hub. Okay, now that's been created, let's go back to Visual Studio. Now, the second console application that I have in the sample programs is the Azure Streaming Analytics demo. Now, like the first project I showed you, I've tried to keep this one pretty simple. And so there's just one main NuGet package, which is the Microsoft Azure Event Hubs NuGet package. This is pretty new. Also, we have the Newton.json, so I can convert back and forth from C# objects to JavaScript object notation. Now, when you open up this particular application, you need two things. You need the Event Hub connection string. We'll go ahead and add that in. And remember, that's really more of the Event Hub container, the Event Hub namespace connection string. And so what is the Event Hub name? Well, basically it is Lab A inside there. So now that I have that, let's take a quick look at the code inside here. And what you're going to see is there's not a lot of code for us to be able to send events to an Azure Event Hub. So there is this special object, and this object is the Event Hub client. And so when you create an Event Hub client, you basically give it the connection string and the entity path, which is just Lab A. It's just the name of the Event Hub. We create this thing which is called Event Hub's connection string builder. And we initialize that by passing the connection string and the name of the Event Hub. And then we say Event Hub client, create from connection string. Now, here's just a custom type I have, a thermometer. And so I'm going to go ahead and create that. And notice that I have a couple different types back here. If I go and look at this other source file, which is the heisenberglabs.cs file, you're going to see I have a reading temperature, I have a thermometer class inside there. And the idea is I'm able to get the next temperature And we're going to get the temperature messages by basically taking this temperature reading instance and being able to serialize it as a particular object. So back here, what's going to happen is we're going to get this one specific object back each time, which I basically modeled to be the message or the event that we're passing over. Now, in our case right here, the NuGet package that allows us to push events to the event hub gives me an event data class. So I call new on this, and I basically just pass in the JSON data, and I basically got my event data. And now I can just basically say event hub client.sendAsync. And what's important to note is we're not using HTTP, but we're using the Azure service bus to send things across. Now I'll go ahead and run this application. And now it's basically just going to send events every half second. And each event is basically going to be a message which will dictate the rows that are going to be added inside. Okay, now with the application up and going, we're going to move back into Azure. So far, let's go back to our resource group. And if I look at real-time dashboards, what have we created? We've basically created a event hub namespace and an event hub called Lab A inside there. And we basically now have events that are being streamed into it. So we need to create a listener mechanism. And the way that we do that is by creating a stream analytics job. So once again, we click on the new button and we click on the Internet of Things, and right under the event hub, there is the stream analytics job. Now when I create a new job, I give it a name. Doesn't really matter so much what the name is, but I'm going to call it Streaming Job 1. And so when I create that, I'm going to make sure to put it inside of the same resource group that our event hub is in. We'll go ahead and we'll click on Create. Now when we create an analytics streaming job, let's go back to resource groups. Let's go back to real-time dashboards. You're going to see that now we have this new resource, our streaming job. Let's go ahead and open it up. Now, there's going to be two things that we need to create. One is going to be the input. So the idea is you create an input to tap into the event hub and create a listener. And then we're going to create an output, which is think of it as the entity that creates the dashboard and starts pushing rows inside of it. So step number one, let's go ahead and create our input. So we'll click on Inputs, and we'll go ahead and click on Add. Now, when we create an input, we'll give it a name. This is going to be important because we're going to have to use this name later. So I'm going to call this one Input Stream. And once we have Input Stream, all the other things I'm going to leave as the default. The source type is going to be data stream. Also note that you can have things like lookup tables for reference data, but we're going to just leave that with the default. Everything else down here, note that it basically says what is the service bus namespace, Heisenberg Lab, what is the event hub name, Lab A, what is the event hub policy name. So this needs that access key, the connection string, to be able to call in there and have the permissions to do that. And note that Azure automatically makes it easy for me to set all those things inside there. So we'll go ahead and we're going to click on Create. And so now I've created a input. Now before we create the output, we're going to look at a query. So the idea of a query is that we have some data that's streaming in, and we'd like to process that data before we do something such as write the rows into a Power BI data set. Now let's go up here, and there is a select star into, and that's the name of your output. So eventually that's going to be our dashboard. And then from, that's going to be our input. So we've created an input for this job, which is named Input Stream. So once I've typed those inside there, the idea is that this query tool is going to process the input before it redirects it to the output. Now, with the input stream, I want to test things. So when I click on the ellipse menu, there's the option to upload sample data from a JSON file. That's very popular. But now that I have data that's actually streaming into the Event Hub, I can do something a little bit better. I can say sample data from input. It brings up a screen that allows me to pick a window. So I'm going to say 3 minutes. And now it basically gathers a sample of input data. And what's nice about that, I'm going to wait till this thing stops spinning, is that then we're going to be able to go ahead and click this test button to run our query. So let's go ahead and run our query right here. So we run the query, and as our query runs inside here, I should see output in the results window. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to go across this side here, and if I can get a little bit over to the side, what I want to do is I want to take some of these values. So these are the column names. And with the column names, I'm going to open up Notepad and I'm going to put these things inside here. And the reason that these are going to be important is that we can't have a select star. Instead, we have to actually put the column names inside there for the next step. And that next step is to have a strongly typed result set so that the pieces in Azure we're using can basically create a hybrid data set with the right columns inside. So now that I have those rows, let's go back here and let's go ahead and put those in place right here, and let's test our query one more time. So we go ahead and we run our query, and we want to make sure that this works. I look down here, looks like everything's coming back, and so we're going to go ahead and save our query. And so when we save our query, now we've basically saved the work that we're doing. After we take input data from the stream, we're able to process it with this query and then basically pass it to the output. Now here, we've talked about an output which is called dashboard, but I haven't created the output yet. So we're going to create that now. We'll go to output, I'll click on add, and we have to make sure that whatever we've named the output in the query, we basically use the same thing inside here. So dashboard is the name that we've used. Let's go ahead and get rid of all the other junk inside there. Now, once I name it, the next thing we're going to look at is what is going to be our sync. And it's not going to be an event hub. That's our input. So the output, I'm going to click on Power BI. Now, when I click on Power BI, I'm basically asking the Azure streaming job to basically reach into my Power BI environment, my personal workspace as me. So I have to authorize it. I go ahead and click the authorize button, and I'm going to go ahead and log in here. I have to make sure I use the correct account inside. So once I've got that correct account, let's go ahead and log in. And the idea is once I have authorized inside here, what we're doing is we're basically giving a permission or a refresh token to this entity. Now, it then connects to Power BI as me under my identity, and now what it's able to do is show me the different app workspaces in my personal workspace. So I'm going to write this into my personal workspace inside here. What's going to be the name of the data set? Well, let's go ahead and call that one Demo 4. And so this is the streaming job data set. And note, it's going to be a hybrid data set when I create it this way. What's going to be the table name? I'll just call that real-time data. And now we're going to go ahead and click on create. And so now we've done all the work to basically create a new hybrid data set. Now, it doesn't automatically go out and create it. The last piece that we have to do is we have to go ahead and start this up. And here's the moment of truth where I figure out whether I've done this correctly. So I'll go ahead and click on start. And the idea is when I start this up, it is going to reach into Power BI as me, go to my personal workspace, and it's going to try to create a new hybrid data set. Well, there it goes. Streaming job started successfully. That's good news. So let's go ahead and move back into the browser, back into Power BI. And now I'm going to go ahead and click off and click back on. And what we should see is that there is a new data set inside there, which is Demo 4, Streaming Job Data Set. Now you've seen that, let me go ahead and click on the Create Report. So I could either create real-time tiles, or I could basically use the report designer. So let's go ahead and add in a particular visual right here. And so we'll go ahead and we will have the time stamp for the access inside there, and then we'll have the temperature inside. Okay, and so now that we have the temperature inside, let's go ahead and choose File, Save. And so we'll save this one as Demo 4. And then we'll also go ahead and we will create a new dashboard. This one will be Demo 4 and Azure Streaming. And so we'll go ahead and we'll move over to the dashboard. And what we can see is that we have real-time data coming in. Okay, let's go ahead and make this one a little bit bigger right here. And just to kind of show that it's definitely a hybrid data set, let's go ahead and click on Add Tile. Let's add one of those streaming data tiles inside there too. So in our case right here, here's our streaming job data set. Let's go ahead and choose Next. Let's go ahead and add the gauge like we have before. We'll go ahead and say, here is the temperature we want to read. What is the minimum value? What is the maximum value? And then what is the target value inside there? And now we'll go ahead and choose Next and Apply. And so now we've basically got something working inside here. Let's go ahead and take this one, move it over here. Maybe I'll make this one a little bit smaller inside here. And now that we've done that, we'll move this one over to the side. But the whole time, you've kind of seen the front to back demo. I created an event hub. Once I created the event hub, I configured my custom application to start pushing events inside there. And every event has basically the data for a single row. Then we created the Azure streaming job. We connected to the event hub and we configured its output to basically push out into a new Power BI hybrid data set. And there you have it, many different ways in which you can create a Power BI real-time data set. So we begin by just looking fundamentally at what are real-time data sets, and we saw the differences between the streaming, the hybrid, and the push style data sets. We looked at using the Power BI Service API to create data sets in a custom application and to push rows in. And we basically saw that when you use a streaming data set, quite often you have a very small window of time that you're looking at and you want very precise values, such as the measure of a temperature or a stock price. We also looked at push data sets that give you a lot more flexibility in terms of how much data you want to store, and definitely in terms of data modeling, in the fact that you can have multiple tables and have measures. Finally, we basically saw how to integrate Azure Streaming Analytics and Azure Event Hubs together so that you can have a high volume listener and you're able to basically take the incoming events, translate them into rows that are added in to a Power BI hybrid data set. Now, let's go ahead and finish off with one more call out to our training at Critical Path, your one-stop shopping for moving up the Power BI learning curve. We have Power BI Bootcamp, really aimed towards database professionals and data analysts. And the focus of the course is working with Power BI Desktop, creating app workspaces, and basically creating both reporting and dashboarding solutions and pushing them out to a large audience. We also have Power BI Developer Bootcamp, which teaches good things like creating custom visuals with TypeScript, working with the Power BI Service API to do things like work with Power BI Embedded. Also, we teach how to program in R and how to integrate your R into Power BI. And then finally, we're teaching you now how to create custom connectors using the M programming language. Definitely a cutting edge topic you won't find in your Microsoft official curriculum courses, only at Critical Path Training. Thanks so much for listening.